Freshen up, Miss Knight, and meet me back in the living room in 45 minutes. We'll have to work through dinner, Dante Damaso commanded, as he tugged off his tie with one hand and poured himself a brandy with the other. Cleopatra Pandora Knight stared at her boss with a simmering resentment that she hid behind a mask of impassivity. She was exhausted. They had landed at Narita Airport that afternoon and had hit the ground running, with one meeting after the next, as they attempted to deal with the bureaucratic red tape that had delayed the start of construction on Dante's new hotel. All she wanted was a hot shower and a good night's sleep, since she knew that she had to face more of the same frenetic pace tomorrow. Sadly, that was not to be. The boss wasn't done working, and that meant no sleep for Cleo until he said so. "Yes, Mr. Damaso," she said demurely, keeping her voice low and emotionless. He didn't acknowledge her response, picking up a newspaper and perusing the headlines with the intense focus he gave whatever activity he happened to be engaged in at any given moment. Recognizing the dismissal, Cleo turned and headed for her room. When Cleo realized that she would be sharing the penthouse suite of one of the most exclusive hotels in Tokyo with her boss, she had a moment of panic. Until she'd seen the suite, her entire apartment back in Cape Town could fit into this place several times over. It had 3 huge bedrooms, 2 full bathrooms, and a living room. Nothing but the best for Dante Damaso. Until his hotel was built, he would stay in what would soon be the second best hotel in Tokyo. Cleo rolled her head on her shoulders and listened to her neck creak with the movement. God, she felt like she could sleep for a week, whereas the boss barely looked winded. It was a little infuriating how indefatigable he was, especially since it impacted Cleo directly. She sighed and allowed herself a moment of self-pity before rummaging through her suitcase for a change of clothing and padding to the bathroom. She was back in the living room exactly 40 minutes later, dressed in a modest blue slip dress, in which she felt a lot more comfortable than the suits she was required to wear for this job. Her short bob was still damp from the shower, and she hadn't bothered with makeup. She hoped that the boss wouldn't mind her lack of formality, and was relieved to note that he'd removed his tie, unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his white shirt, and folded back his shirt sleeves to reveal extremely masculine forearms. Her favorite kind, strong, lightly dusted with hair, with raised veins mapping a path to his capable-looking hands. He looked up and grunted when she entered the room. "Good, you're back. We have to go through today's minutes and compile a list of the most pertinent facts. Then take care of the day's correspondence. You get started on that. I have to make a few phone calls." He turned away from her and lifted his phone to his ear. Cleo stared at his broad back for a moment before trudging over to the laptop with a muffled sigh. She wondered if he'd ordered room service yet. She was starving. She glanced around the room and gasped in outrage when she saw the room service cart standing off to the side of the room, with the uncovered empty plates precariously stacked one on top of the other. Another quick look around the room told her that there was definitely no other food around. Had he actually forgotten to order something for her? Was the man wholly incapable of thinking of anybody but himself? She picked up the room telephone to order her own meal, but he had finished his call and cast her a sharp look. "Stop wasting time, Knight," he growled, tapping away at the screen of his phone. "We have a lot of work to do. I didn't bring you along to sit around looking pretty and doing nothing." The injustice of that statement left her fuming, and she bit back a sarcastic retort, knowing that she had no alternative but to swallow down the anger she felt toward him. Cleo knew that due to the last-minute nature of this trip, she'd been his only choice as assistant. And since the man had avoided testing her full potential in the office up until now, he didn't trust her to get anything done competently. Still, Cleo had jumped at the opportunity to join him. The heady excitement of a trip to Japan, combined with the desire to prove herself capable of doing this job to both Dante Damaso and to herself, had proved hard to resist. Yet now, feeling completely overwhelmed, all she wanted was to run back home with her tail between her legs, all because her boss was doing his level best to be an ass. "Don't respond. Don't respond." She repeated the two words over and over to herself. No mouthing off at the boss, no matter how much he deserved it. An hour and a half later, after they had powered their way through a series of emails and memos and had pored over her notes from the day's many meetings, Cleo was starting to feel cross-eyed from staring at the computer screen too long. Her brain was scrambled, and she was practically drooping with exhaustion. Even though she hadn't eaten since the flight a decade ago, she was too damned tired even to think about her stomach. Dante Damaso peered at her when she stopped tapping at the keys and frowned over the top of his black-rimmed glasses. "Let's take a 5-minute break," he suggested, and Cleo almost melted into a puddle of gratitude. She stretched lavishly and enjoyed a jaw-popping yawn at the same time. A quick look at her boss told her that while he had suggested a break, he wasn't taking one himself. His head was once more bent over zoning ordinances and blueprints. The man really was tireless, a trait that she found both admirable and frustrating at the moment. She supposed years of international travel and frantic work schedules had inured him somewhat to the effects of a 48-hour-long day, one that had started on a completely different continent. She padded over to the huge floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked Tokyo in all its sparkling glory. She had never seen anything remotely close to this spectacular view. The city was vast, and its lights sprawled as far as the eye could see. Despite being 40 floors removed from the heaving excitement of the city, Cleo could feel it calling to her like a seductive siren. She turned away from the allure and found herself inadvertently appreciating a spectacular view of a different kind. Big, sexy Dante Damaso, as she had never seen him before, ruffled, stubbled, and completely disheveled. The look suited him and gave him an edge that the normally smooth, urbane man kept hidden beneath layers of intimidating sophistication and flawless tailoring. It was an image of the man she really preferred not to have in her head, because it made him seem a lot more human, more approachable than he usually was. He looked up and happened to catch her eye, and even from across the room, she could see something spark and smolder in his gaze. It was gone in a flash, and she wondered if her tired brain had tricked her into seeing things. She wandered over to the exquisite coffee table where she had left her cell phone to charge and checked her messages. A couple from her brother, Lush, and her best friend, Cal, and one informing her that she could very well have won 500 grand already. Fantastic. She allowed herself a moment of pure whimsy. With her winnings, there'd be no further need to spend her mornings making coffee, watering Dante Damaso's precious ficus, or sending the polite equivalent of "thanks for the sex, let's never see each other again. Notes with flowers to her boss's random lady friends. In the nearly 4 months that she'd been working for him, she'd already sent 5 notes, accompanying equally polite, pretty floral tributes. It was sickening. Her nose wrinkled at the thought, and she jumped guiltily when the object of her thoughts called her name curtly. "Yes, sir? Ready to get back to work?"
"Not really."
"Of course, sir," she said, proud that she managed to keep her voice relatively emotionless. She sat down at the antique secretary that she had claimed as her workstation and tried to hide her wince when her butt and back hit the hard, unforgiving surface of the ornate high-back chair. She rolled her shoulders and sighed quietly as she closed her eyes and kneaded the tightly knotted muscles in the back of her neck. "Tired?" She jumped when Damaso's voice came from behind her, and she looked up over her shoulder to meet his dark, enigmatic gaze. He'd come up to within half a yard of the back of her chair and had his hands shoved into his trouser pockets. He was staring down at her, his eyes narrowed and intent. "A little," she admitted. He nodded, never taking his eyes off hers, and seemed to weigh his next words before speaking. "Would you like a neck rub?" Cleo blinked, shocked by both the question and the heat that flared in his eyes. She knew very well what that neck rub would entail, where it would lead, and he meant for her to know that. Until that very moment, she would never have guessed that the man had even noticed her as a female. Yet the way he was looking at her right now told her that he very much appreciated what he was seeing. He kept his hands to himself, and his expression, despite everything going on in his eyes, impassive. If she refused his offer, and all it entailed, she imagined he would simply shrug it off, and they would carry on as if this crazy moment had never happened. The question was, did she want to refuse him? She was tired, frustrated, and his offer could be a fantastic way to let off steam and unwind after a hard day.
Who would it harm?
They were both consenting adults. There was no romance or love or hearts and flowers here. She might dislike him, but she'd be lying to herself if she didn't admit to feeling sexually curious about him. Maybe just this once? Just a taste. This was sex. Plain and simple. And sometimes that's really all anybody needed. Dante Damaso watched the play of emotions on his assistant's ridiculously expressive face. Shock and confusion, followed by intrigue, trepidation, and definite interest. He couldn't have surprised himself more with that damned question. She was a tempting little thing, which he'd been trying damned hard to overlook in light of their personal connection through her brother. To that end, he limited the amount of time he spent with her as much as possible. But right now, he was as human as the next guy. He was irritated by the way his day had gone, and his frustration built as the hours wore on, with little progress being made. Now, after seeing this woman in her distracting blue dress, he was also horny as hell. He could do something about at least one of those things, but if she wasn't interested, they'd move on. It would probably be for the best anyway. Considering the spur-of-the-moment nature of his proposition, he should withdraw his offer and leave it at that. After all, he couldn't think of a more inappropriate... Yes, thank you. Her whispered words brought his common-sense train of thought to a screeching halt, and his jaw dropped as he watched her dip her head, allowing the sharply defined points of her sleek bob to swing forward and hide her face. His throat went bone dry, and all sound judgment fled as he watched his hands reach for that vulnerable nape. He hesitated, just shy of touching her, and inhaled deeply, catching a whiff of the fresh, floral scent that had tantalized his senses all evening. When his fingers finally made contact with her soft, exposed flesh, his breath shuddered out of his chest in tandem with hers. He was instantly, painfully, and immutably hard, and he allowed himself to deepen his touch, even though every instinct in him was screaming that this was a mistake. This is a mistake. The thought which had been buzzing around in Cleo's head from the moment of initial contact between them, through their first stunning kiss, into the shedding of her clothing, and then when his mouth latched onto her breast for the first time, was getting ever more insistent. But Cleo had more interesting things to focus on, like the way his large, assertive hand was making its way down her body to, "Oh, God!" she moaned as that hand did magical, sinful, unimaginable things. Her back arched, and his smoldering gaze fell to the beaded tips of her breasts. She uttered another breathless little cry when his hot mouth fixed on one hypersensitive nub. Her fingers curled into his silky hair as she tried to keep him there. I can't." Her voice tapered off into a high-pitched whine when his supremely talented mouth left her breast only to lavish the same treatment on the other mound. She could feel his hot hardness poised at her entrance, and her hands left his hair to claw at his back and tight buttocks, trying to pull him toward her. He lifted his head to stare down at her, his eyes feverish as they pinned her with single-minded concentration. "You want me?" God, his sexy voice, roughened with desire and strain, nearly made her come right on the spot. She couldn't quite believe how much he was making her feel, how very much she wanted him inside her. She couldn't remember wanting any other man half as much as she did this one. And yet, "This is a mistake!" The words had grown shrill and insistent, but Cleo pushed them away as she reached up for another one of those drugging kisses. He complied, but only for the very briefest of seconds. Her frustration reached new heights when he took himself in hand and deliberately ran his blunt, sheathed tip down her slick, sensitive channel. From the tight bundle of nerves at the apex, slowly back down to her entrance, where he came to rest for a long, aching moment. "You want this? Yes?" He pressed forward slowly, and she hissed when she felt him breach her, so much thicker and harder than she had ever had before. "Mistake!" The clamoring was incessant, but she ignored it again and arched toward him. He refused to comply, remaining still, not even breathing, giving her just that one small taste of what was to come. "See? Yes?" His voice remained annoyingly steady, but the fevered gleam in his eyes told her he wasn't as indifferent as he seemed. "Yes, damn you." She truly hated him in that moment, and a bit of venom seeped into her voice. "Yes, I want you. I crave this. I need... Oh." This last as he inched forward with such slowness and care that it felt like forever before he was buried from tip to hilt. He was almost uncomfortably large, and it took her out of the moment for a brief second. Sensing her discomfort, he rested there and gave her time to adjust to his size, while he lowered his head and focused his lavish attentions on her breasts again. He braced one of his hands on the bed beside her head, keeping his weight off her, and allowed his other hand to go roaming When that hand finally dawdled its way down to where they were joined, Cleo was already arching her hips toward his. He grinned and slid his free hand under her to palm her butt and adjust her position. He sat upright, knelt between her spread thighs, and dragged her even closer. It was a seriously sexy position. Sprawled flat on her back, while he feasted his eyes on her uninhibited nakedness. He lifted her higher, forcing himself even deeper inside, and then, with a wicked grin, finally began to move again. "Play with your breasts," he commanded, his voice sounding a little breathless. She complied, rolling the distended nipples between her thumbs and fingertips, then flicking at them. He grunted in approval and moved his hands to her hips, angling her upward while he continued his assertive thrusting. God, he is magnificent. Sweat beaded on his forehead, dampened his hair, and added a fine sheen to his bronzed skin. He kept his focus on where they were joined, watching intently as he plowed into her tightness. His brow furrowed and his chest heaved, the first real signs that he was as affected as she was. "Give me your hand," he growled, and she reluctantly released one taut nipple and lifted her right hand toward him. He didn't release her hips. Instead, he leaned down, captured her middle finger in his hot mouth, and sucked it inside. After one final, seductive lick, he released her finger. "Touch yourself," he said, and she groaned before obediently doing as he had commanded. "Good." The word was so gruff, it was barely recognizable. Cleo was unbelievably turned on by the picture she presented to his lascivious gaze. She had never been sexually shy, but this was way beyond anything she'd ever experienced. Her back arched off the bed, her thighs lay sprawled across his, and she was quite unashamedly pleasuring herself for his and her own gratification. This was complete abandonment with the least likely man in the world, and she wasn't at all sure how she'd gotten here. She was well past the point of no return, and the inevitable was but a heartbeat away. And then it was there, and so cataclysmic that her whole body simply clenched. The sharp cry that she uttered died in her throat as every single atom of her being focused inward on an explosion of pleasure, so powerful it tore her apart and left her feeling vulnerable and emotionally raw. His orgasm finally took him. She watched in fascination as his eyes slid shut, his head flew back, and every cord in his neck stood out in stark relief. He gritted his teeth, preventing even the faintest of sounds from emerging. Only the sharp catch and gradual release of his breath gave any indication of how much the climax had affected him. She resented his control, hated how she had given herself so completely, while he, for all intents and purposes, had kept a cool head from that first kiss to this last lazy thrust. His grip on her thighs finally loosened, and she imagined she'd have bruises in the shape of his fingertips on her butt and thighs by morning. She could barely move as he smoothly extricated himself from her, tugged off the condom, and fell flat on his face on the bed beside her, his long, muscular legs still entangled with hers. "Thanks, Chloe. I needed that." His voice was slurred. He sounded like a very drunk or very tired man, and the gentle snore that followed a mere second later confirmed the latter fact. Cleo sighed, trying not to be completely demoralized by the fact that this man, whom she had known for nearly 4 frickin' months, had just called her by the wrong name. She maneuvered her way completely out from beneath him, sat on the side of the bed, and pushed herself up onto unsteady legs, feeling like a newborn calf. She knew she should probably get back to her own room, because she very much doubted that he would appreciate waking up with her still beside him. She hunted around the room for her dress and underwear, but couldn't find her panties. Why did it have to be her panties? She dressed hastily and was thankful that her walk of shame would span only the length of his room to the connecting door that led to her room. Nobody else would see her. When she had the door firmly shut behind her, she wobbled over to the bed, where most of the contents of her suitcase were chaotically strewn all over the duvet cover, and sank down in relief. Her entire body still shook in the aftermath of the best sex and the biggest mistake of her life. She buried her face in her hands. "It's just sex," she told herself, and was embarrassed by the unsteady pitch of her voice. And by the lie, she was definitely embarrassed by the blatant lie, even if the only person she was trying to deceive was herself. That wasn't just sex. That had been the most mind-numbing, bone-melting, awe-inspiring 45 minutes of her life, and there was no getting around that. The irritating man certainly knew his way around a woman's body. Her nipples ached just thinking about it, and to be frank, everything else was still tightening and convulsing in the aftermath of the soul-shattering orgasm she'd just had. But to sleep with Dante Damaso, she shuddered in a way that had nothing to do with the micro-explosions, still tingling all over her body, and everything to do with the fact that she could barely stand the man. So what if he was mouth-wateringly gorgeous? He was still an obnoxious, misogynistic jerk with a smug self-assurance that rubbed her the wrong way every time he spoke. Then there was the way he practically sneered every time he said, "Miss Knight," or the way he couldn't seem to look at her when he talked to her, or seemed incapable of a single please or thank you. And horribly, after one stupid mistake on her very first day of work, he now insisted on painstakingly checking every single letter she typed for him before she was allowed to email it. It was humiliating, and while the mistake hadn't been repeated since then, he made it absolutely clear that he did not trust her to do anything more challenging than make coffee, water the plant, and send his kiss-off notes. Of course, he didn't micromanage the rest of his staff the way he did Cleo, and she knew if he weren't one of her brother's buddies, Dante would probably have fired her within the first week. But she was damned if she'd quit, the way he obviously expected, wanted her to, and she had slept with him. She couldn't even blame alcohol, exhaustion, or temporary insanity. Hold on. Maybe she could blame temporary insanity. She must have lost her mind. Why else would she have slept with the condescending, arrogant bastard? She headed toward the ensuite bathroom, tugging off her hopelessly wrinkled dress as she went. She fumbled with the complicated bells and whistles in the shower cubicle. It's a shower. Why is it so damn difficult anyway? She finally got the water going and gratefully stepped beneath the powerful spray before swearing and fumbling with the knobs and buttons to set it to a temperature less than scalding. Damn it. The words were mild but heartfelt. She didn't know if she was sophisticated enough to be cool about a one-night stand with her boss, whom she despised. She rested her forehead on the cool tiles before thumping it softly and rhythmically against the unforgiving surface. This was a disaster. She enjoyed sex, but she had never previously indulged outside at least a semi-committed relationship. This was uncharted territory for her. Where did they go from here? Of all the stupid... She shook herself. She wasn't achieving anything with the self-recriminations. It had happened. Now she needed to figure out how the hell she was going to get through the rest of their time here, and what she would do if she had to find a new job once they got back to Cape Town. It would suck if it came to that, because she really enjoyed the challenge of this job. Back in South Africa, Dante regularly swapped her for other executive assistants in the upper echelons of his global, multi-billion-dollar leisure industry conglomerate. And it was on those days Cleo truly liked her new job. None of the other executives seemed to doubt her competence, and rarely gave her the mind-numbingly boring and simplistic tasks Dante liked to saddle her with. Cleo finished her shower and wrapped herself in the warm terry cloth robe provided by the hotel. She sauntered over to the huge floor-to-ceiling window and stared out at the sprawling nightscape. She had always dreamed of visiting Japan, had hoped to dance here someday. She allowed herself a small, wistful smile and a momentary pang at the thought of all she'd lost before shoving the memory of what she'd once been able to do, what she still yearned to do, back into a box and placing it into a mental drawer. She could never fully shut that damned drawer. It was always slightly open, and every so often, something the dream of a different life would escape from it and haunt her reality. She drew in a long breath and released it shakily. She had way too much else going on right now. She couldn't allow the coulda, shoulda bins to intrude on what was already an emotionally impactful night. She tried to empty her mind of everything and focus only on the view. From her 40th floor vantage point, the shimmering lights looked as pretty as a Christmas tree. But she wondered at the constant frenetic activity in this crazy city that didn't seem to have slowed down at all. Despite the lateness of the hour, she knew she should try to get some sleep. It was after 3 a.m, and Dante Damaso would undoubtedly be up, dressed, and disgustingly alert by 7. She crawled into the king-size bed, which was positioned so she could still see the skyline. She curled up on her side and stared down at the blinking lights of the traffic far, far below before drifting into a restless sleep. Dante woke as he usually did, fully aware of his surroundings and not the slightest bit groggy despite the lack of sleep and jet lag. For once that ability wasn't a blessing, not when he was immediately bombarded by the memory of the colossal error in judgment he had made the night before. Shit, he hissed beneath his breath, wasting a brief moment of his very precious time on a twinge of regret before shrugging that smidgen of conscience away. Instead, he attempted to focus his attention on a solution to what could definitely become a problem. The sex had been quite good, really, and just what he'd needed to blow off the frustrations of the day. But the girl was his employee, a very junior employee, and Dante hardly ever went there. Plus, she was his friend's sister, and Dante for damn sure never went there, and yet he'd gone there last night and had no one to blame but himself. To give Chloe her due, she had never looked at him in that way, never hinted at wanting any form of sexual relationship with him. If anything, until last night, she had been indifferent toward him, and even seemed to dislike him at times. He snorted at that last thought, dismissing it as unlikely. When women pretended indifference, they were usually playing hard to get, and she was definitely the type to play ridiculous games like that. Look how easily she'd fallen into his bed last night. Surely that was proof she'd been harboring some sort of attraction for him all along. He just hoped she didn't think it would be the start of something. He really didn't need the complication of breaking Luke's sister's heart. He liked the guy, and they had been friends for a long time. And even though Dante had known of her existence, he had never actually met Luke's sister until she applied for this job. He hadn't been too enthused by the idea of giving her the position, especially in light of his unexpected physical response to her presence. But he wasn't about to offend one of his few real friends by refusing to give the man's precious sister a job no matter how woefully underqualified she was on paper. He shook himself impatiently, irritated that he had already wasted this much time on the incident when he had to figure out how to approach the precarious situation with the Shinjuku metropolitan government. He resented having to devote any of his time to considering the possible ramifications of his ill-advised sexual encounter with a woman, not when he had so many other pressing issues to deal with. He shook his head as he rose from bed and crossed to the bathroom for a quick shower. He had the utmost confidence he would handle this incident in the best way possible. It was just sex, after all. By the time he was dressed and ready to face the day, he had already dismissed the episode and was focused on other, far more important matters. When Cleo joined Dante in the living room, he greeted her with his usual morning grunt, keeping his focus on his laptop. "Miss Knight, I need you to send an urgent email to Miles Kinross for the Phase 1 original blueprints," he said, without looking up. "Right now?" she asked, and he lifted his gaze from the computer screen to frown at her. "Yes, right now. I wouldn't use the word urgent," he used mocking air quotes, "if I didn't want it right now." Cleo gritted her teeth, bit back the sarcastic retort hovering on the tip of her tongue, and settled for saccharine sweetness instead. "Well, I only ask, sir, because it's midnight in South Africa, and Mr. Kinross may not be checking his emails. I thought you might prefer the direct approach of a phone call instead." "Then make yourself useful and get him on the line. Be proactive for a change." She lifted her brows and picked up her company phone. She really wished she hadn't fallen into bed with this man so easily. But having regrets now, while she still sported patches of stubble burn on her inner thighs and her breasts tingled tantalizingly, was a waste of energy. His sultry mouth had trailed over every inch of her skin, and his heavy stubble had left a pale pink trail in some of the places he had lingered. There was even a faint sting in the small of her back, telling her she probably wore the same naughty stubble burn just above her butt. Cleo endeavored not to dwell too much on the unwelcome and intimate physical reminders of her lapse in judgment last night. But that wasn't an easy thing to do when she could barely suppress a shiver as she recalled how masterfully he had flipped her onto her stomach and dragged his wicked lips down from the nape of her neck to, "Miss Knight?" "Whoa!" She snapped out of the raunchy daze and stared blankly into his impatient face. "The phone call?" "Yes, of course," she sputtered, feeling foolish as she dialed the number. Miles Kinross, as she had suspected, had already retired for the night, and not alone, if the sultry feminine voice in the background was anything to go by. Kinross was a handsome man, and if office gossip was to be believed, Like Dante Damaso, he rarely dated the same woman for longer than a month or two. Cleo was in the middle of explaining what they needed when the phone was yanked rudely from her hand, and Dante took over the conversation. She straightened her shoulders, determined to ignore his boorish behavior, and headed over to the lavish buffet breakfast he must have ordered from room service. At least he'd remembered to order enough for two this time. She allowed herself another flash of aggravation at the memory of how he had completely overlooked her need for a meal last night.
Inconsiderate bastard.
No wonder she'd been so susceptible to his dubious charms. She'd been suffering from impaired judgment due to starvation. Dying of hunger now, she heaped her plate with scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and toast before sitting down to dig in. She barely managed more than a mouthful before he concluded his call. There's no time for breakfast. We're running late as it is. Our first meeting is in 40 minutes, and the driver has informed me that it'll take at least half an hour to get there in rush hour traffic. I don't want to be late. It's unprofessional and considered extremely rude in Japan. Oh, but... She stared longingly down at her still full plate. If you'd been up earlier, you would have had more time to eat, he pointed out as he picked up his briefcase. Yeah, right. Cleo had dawdled over her morning prep, gathering her courage to face him. She had tried to anticipate every possible scenario. He'd sweep her up into his arms and propose a torrid affair. He'd be unable to meet her eyes and unsure of what to say to her. He'd explain how their indiscretion had been only a passing thing, never to be repeated. She hadn't expected this. This complete lack of acknowledgement of what had been a huge breach of office conduct. In fact, he was so completely normal and unaffected, she wondered if he even remembered their little oopsie. She shoveled down one last forkful of eggs before getting up with a resigned sigh. She smoothed her black, pinstriped pencil skirt down over her thighs and glanced up in time to catch a smoldering look in his dark eyes. Oh, my...
Let's go,
he growled, stepping aside and allowing her to precede him. For one glorious moment, that look helped her push aside her insecurities and made her feel powerful and feminine enough to add a deliberate little shimmy to her walk as she sidled past him. Dante bit back the stream of profanity threatening to escape his lips and focused instead on internalizing his annoyance. A resurgence of sexual tension was the last thing he needed right now. He'd believed he had successfully put the whole incident firmly behind him, but the way that no-nonsense skirt clung to her pert little ass was more than a little distracting, especially now that he knew she was probably wearing cute little cotton cartoon character panties, similar to the ones she'd worn last night. Beneath the pinstriped twill, he ground his teeth as he followed her out, forcing his eyes up from the tight curve of her butt to her narrow back, and tried to regain his focus. He was only marginally successful, distracted by the light, fresh scent of her shampoo as it wafted back toward him and the sassy bounce of her silky hair. He battled with his hormones all the way down to the car, where the stifling humidity and heat outside displaced his infuriating horniness with discomfort of a different kind. Wow, this humidity is crazy, his distracting little assistant said as they settled into the air-conditioned black luxury sedan. Dante grunted non-committally and yanked out his tablet to check his notes for the meeting. Is it always like this in Tokyo? Why the hell was she still prattling on? She rarely made small talk with him, and he preferred it that way. When they did speak, it was strictly work-related. I've never been to Japan before, so I didn't know what to expect. Weather-wise, I mean. I knew it was summer, and knew it would be hot, but I really wasn't expecting this humidity. I mean, it's like a sauna out there. He sighed before putting his tablet aside. Chloe, he said, keeping his voice low so the driver couldn't hear them. Last night was just to relieve some of the stress of the day. You know that, right? I don't usually fuck my employees. Too damned messy. And quite frankly, he didn't relish the potential sexual harassment lawsuits from disgruntled sexual partners in the workplace. But he didn't tell her that. God knows he didn't need to plant that idea in her head. And then, of course, there was the fact this had happened so unexpectedly, he hadn't gone to the usual legal lengths to protect himself. He was generally a hell of a lot more careful and more discreet when it came to choosing his sexual partners. He cleared his throat before continuing. We were both tense and in need of some stress relief. It's not necessary to make this awkward. She muttered something beneath her breath, and he frowned. What? Cleo. It's Cleo, she said, meeting his gaze head on, her ridiculously beautiful green eyes brimming with defiance. My name's Cleo, not Chloe. Shit. Right, of course, he cleared his throat. Of course he knew her name was Cleo. He even remembered thinking Cleopatra Pandora Knight was a damned stupid name. But for some reason, after months of calling her nothing but Miss Knight, that pertinent fact had completely slipped his mind. He felt his cheeks heat up as he recalled using Chloe during and immediately after sex the night before. What kind of asshole forgets a woman's name while he's naked in bed with her? And don't worry, I wouldn't dream of making anything awkward for you. I'm just curious about the country. I'm not fantasizing about some happily ever after love affair with you or anything. The thought of that is as distasteful to me as it probably is to you. Distasteful? Who the hell did she think she was? Better women than she would kill for the chance of a love affair with him. And why the hell was he even offended? She was nothing more than his employee. His very annoying and very temporary employee. So they'd had a little lapse in judgment. So what? Shit like that happened all the time. Not to him, but there was a first time for everything. Let's just keep our focus on work, he stipulated. The sooner we get this delay sorted out, the sooner we get out of here and on with our lives. Amen to that. Cleo was proud of herself. Proud that she had managed to keep her temper in check and her mouth shut. And definitely proud that she had managed to curb the impulse to slap the stupid man right across his handsome, smug face. Just do the job, Cleo. Keep doing the job. And when something more interesting comes along, you can move on with your head held high. This wasn't going to be another one of her failures. Another lost opportunity because she couldn't hold her tongue or restrain her impulsive nature and uncertain temper. Working for Dante Damaso had tested her to her limits, even though, thankfully, she'd rarely had to deal directly with him until this trip. She wasn't going to let him ruin this career opportunity for her. The potential for growth in this company was huge. Dante had hired her as a temporary replacement for his pregnant assistant, with the assurance that after Donna returned, they would find a permanent position for Cleo within the company. And while Cleo still wasn't entirely sure this was the kind of work she wanted to do for the rest of her life, it was what she'd fallen back on when her true vocation had slipped beyond her reach. It didn't light up all the empty spaces in her soul the way dance did, didn't inspire her, or make her want to leap out of bed in the mornings, even when every muscle in her body protested the slightest of movements. But it was something, and she was relatively good at it, so it would have to do. Up until this job, she'd been drifting from one temp position to the next. But this was the first one offering job security, benefits, and all the other good stuff grown-ups aspired to. Cleo, who had felt like a total failure up until that point, had jumped at the opportunity. God knows she had to stop depending on her big brother to help her out every time she failed at something. Luke was getting married soon, and while his fiancée, Blue, was a sweetheart, Cleo couldn't keep staying with him every time she lost an apartment because she was unable to pay the rent. Luke had never minded. He insisted that the house, which had once belonged to their grandparents, was half hers anyway, and she had as much right to stay there as he did. But with Luke probably starting a family soon, Cleo just wouldn't feel right running to him every time life dumped an obstacle on her path. She already felt like a loser, and sleeping with the boss, just another thing in a long line of really bad decisions, intensified that feeling times infinity. Cleo had been good at only one thing in her life, dancing, and after years of hard work and countless personal and physical sacrifices, she had been well on her way to establishing herself as a talent of note before an accident just after her 24th birthday had robbed her of that career path. Doctors told her she would never dance professionally again, and it was a fact Cleo had difficulty accepting. She still felt like she could dance. It was still there in her heart and soul. How could they tell her she couldn't do the one thing she loved above all else? Without dance in her life, she had found herself rudderless and devastatingly average. Now, all she had left were her brain and a sharp tongue that kept getting her into trouble at the worst possible times. That tongue had been responsible for most of her past workplace failures, but her intelligence was what kept her constantly employed, even if she couldn't quite keep the jobs. She glanced at Dante, who was poring over his iPad again, and managed, barely, to keep from rolling her eyes in derision. She watched him covertly and tried to keep her appraisal objective. He was sickeningly good-looking. Dante Damaso was all gorgeous golden skin, topped with black as night wavy hair he kept clipped ruthlessly short and combed back with a conservative side part. There was barely enough of the luxurious, thick and silky mass for a woman to run her fingers through. His honey-brown eyes were framed by lush, long lashes that curled slightly at the ends and stern, straight eyebrows. His mouth had a full, curved bottom lip and a thin, perfectly bow-shaped upper lip, and it would have been beautiful if not for the cynical sneer perpetually twisting his lips whenever she was in his general vicinity. And of course, he had the straight nose and high cheekbones to go with his perfect looks. It was nauseating, really. A crooked nose would have made him more approachable, more human. It was almost obnoxious for him to be this good-looking, and now that she knew what he looked like beneath his expensive, bespoke dark gray suit, it was even worse. At 33, he was in his prime. He had washboard abs, a butt you could bounce a coin off, gorgeously muscled arms, and her personal weakness killer thighs and calves. and he certainly knew exactly how to use that perfect body to please a woman. No wonder his gorgeous lady friends were always hanging around, even after he ended things with them. Mind-blowing sex and multiple orgasms could become dangerously addicting. While Cleo could definitely empathize with those women, amazing sex wasn't enough to make her moon over a guy, or she'd be in serious trouble right now. Dante Damaso epitomized masculine perfection. It was a damned crying shame such good looks were wasted on a nasty specimen like him. To distract herself from the awkward situation with her boss, Cleo turned her attention to the city just a window's breadth away. She couldn't remember ever seeing this many pedestrians in one place, hustling and bustling and going about their daily lives. She craned her neck and couldn't prevent a giggle from escaping when she spotted a guy in a panda suit crossing the intersection in front of their car. She scrambled for her phone and managed to catch his back as he walked away, his gigantic panda head towering above the other, completely unconcerned pedestrians. Nobody even stared. She absently started taking a few more pics and then several selfies, trying to get as much of the city in the background as possible and adding the really good ones to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. She positioned herself with her back to the window and took a few duck-face selfies while they were stopped at a particularly busy intersection. Dante was so engrossed in his reading that it took a while before the annoying clicking sound penetrated the heavy fog of statistics eddying in his brain. When he finally became aware of it, the click that followed was almost jarring, as it jerked him fully aware of his surroundings. He looked over to where Cleo was, sitting on the far end of the back seat, and blinked when he saw her sucking in her cheeks, plumping up her lips, and lowering her chin as she held her phone slightly above face level and snapped a photograph. Well, that explained the annoying clicking. She shifted her chin slightly to the left and took another picture. Then another and another. I hate to interrupt this narcissistic little love fest you've got going on with your phone, Miss Knight. But surely you have something a little more productive to do with your time. She jumped and dropped her phone, which bounced off the seat and landed right between his shoes. She swore beneath her breath and bent over to retrieve it. He gaped as she squirmed her way between the front passenger seat and his knee, her round butt sticking up and wriggling temptingly right within cupping range of his hands. He held said hands up and away from her body in case they were tempted to do something stupid, like explore the silky, smooth skin of her thighs, which was being revealed one tantalizing millimeter at a time as she maneuvered her way a little farther down. He wasn't quite sure what to do with the provocative, twisting bundle of femininity half draped over his lap. But when one sharp little elbow missed his groin by just an inch, he cursed and took hold of that same elbow and dragged her up onto the seat beside him. "What in the ever-loving hell are you doing?" he asked, sounding livid even to himself. "My phone." "Yeah, I know, and I would have retrieved it for you. You didn't have to drape yourself all over me to get to it." "I didn't." God, her cheeks were flushed. Her usually sleek hair was a mess, and two of her mother-of-pearl blouse buttons had come undone to reveal the pretty blue lace edge of her bra. She looked like a woman who had just been soundly kissed, and because it aroused him to the point of pain, it brought his suspicious nature to bear. "Are you coming on to me?" he hissed. "Wasn't one night enough for you? If you want more than that, you need but say it." but don't expect anything other than sex from me. Just because you're Luke's sister doesn't automatically entitle you to more than that. Once we get this deal out of the way, we can fuck again if that's what you want, but it will never be more than that. Intender? Understand? Oh, I intender, she said, her voice trembling slightly, making him wonder at the extreme emotion he could sense just beneath the surface. I intender that you're a smug, arrogant butthole who thinks the sun revolves around him. I don't like you, but then I don't have to like you. You're just my boss. And while I may have had a moment's weakness last night, it just makes me human. And trust me, one night was enough to last a lifetime. It was great, but I'm not looking for an encore. Cleo let her words sink in, knowing she had just kissed any future with this company goodbye. She allowed herself a moment's regret before clearing her throat and pointing to the floor between his feet. Now, would you mind fetching my phone for me, please, sir? I'd hate for you to get the wrong idea if I went fishing for it again. He kept his gaze level with hers, and the grim set of his mouth told her he wasn't at all impressed with her. Well, to hell with him. His opinion mattered not at all. Just because we have shared some level of intimacy does not give you the right to speak to me so, he said, after a long and unnerving moment of silence. His voice teemed with barely restrained menace. We are not contemporaries, we are not friends, and we are certainly not lovers. No, we're employee. She touched her chest and then lifted the same hand to point at him, and employer. You're my boss, and as I very much doubt I'll have a job after this anyway, I should probably voice my opinions now, while I have you here. Why would you not have a job after this? You think I am so lacking in morals, I would fire you because we spent a mutually pleasurable night together. That was last night, and we were done with work. In this car, right now, I am your employer, and I will be spoken to with respect. Oh, does that mean I get to call you an arrogant butthole after hours? She watched his face tighten and knew she was pushing every single danger button he possessed. What you call me in the privacy of your thoughts is of no concern to me. Just keep those thoughts to yourself. So you're basically placing a gag order on me, she clarified. If that is how you wish to perceive it, then so be it. He reached down to retrieve her phone. A clear indicator, he considered the conversation closed and glanced at the screen before handing it over. This isn't exactly what I would call professional behavior, he said, nodding down at the ridiculous, pouting picture of her on the screen. Embarrassed, she cast her eyes down, hating to feel so completely wrong-footed. It was meant to be ironic, she attempted to explain, even while she knew he would never understand the intended humor behind the picture. I trust you will conduct yourself appropriately at this meeting. Damn it. So much for trying to impress the man with her professionalism and ability to do the job. She tried her best to keep her reply humble. Yes, sir. I apologize if my earlier lack of professionalism caused you to think otherwise, sir, she said in her best no-nonsense voice, although she couldn't quite disguise the sarcasm dripping all over that last word. He raised his eyebrows, indicating He hadn't missed the acerbity, then raked her body from top to toe with his gaze. "You might want to run a comb through your hair," he said, the words dripping with disdain. "Maybe reapply your lipstick while you're at it. Oh, and I'm sure you'd like to adjust your skirt and button your blouse before we get there as well."
Bastard.
She scooted back to her end of the seat and quickly straightened her skirt and fumblingly fixed her blouse, flushing a little when she noticed her bra was showing. A quick check of her hair and makeup confirmed the former was sticking up a bit, and her lipstick was smudged at one corner of her mouth. Wait, how on earth had she managed to smudge her lipstick while trying to pick up her phone? Who did that? This day just got worse and worse, and it wasn't even 8 o'clock yet. She reapplied it and quite pointedly turned her back on him to stare out the window. She wasn't going to let him dampen her excitement of being here, and if this was all she got to see of the city, then she was damned well going to soak it in while she could. She heard him snort softly behind her, but ignored it, willing him to go back to his oh-so-critical preparation. He only needed her here to take notes, write his correspondence, and do all the other menial crap that required little to no thinking. She knew Donna, his executive assistant, had a very challenging and intellectually stimulating job. She handled projects, ran the office in his absence, and had all manner of other important and interesting duties. But Dante didn't trust Cleo to do even a small percentage of what his precious Donna did, and she didn't expect him to. She was nowhere near as qualified. He gave her the basic secretarial stuff to do, while designating the more important tasks to other personal and executive assistants. The little he did entrust to her was always gone over by the man himself with a fine-tooth comb. Naturally, the other assistants were already swamped with their own regular duties and were starting to resent Cleo for not doing the job she was being so handsomely paid for. They knew Luke and Dante were friends because Cleo had foolishly mentioned it to one of the younger admin assistants in an aborted attempt to make friends. The woman had wasted no time spreading rumors that Cleo had been hired because of the relationship between the two men. Nobody would ever accuse Dante of nepotism to his face, of course, so Cleo bore the brunt of their hostility. After that, Cleo had been a lot pickier about whom she spoke to at work. Luckily, there were a number of other people who didn't give the rumors any credence. People like Florence, the lovely tea lady, Solomon, the cheerful company driver, Dante's personal protection guys, and some of the junior staff members who didn't get saddled with her extra work. Despite the short time she'd been working there, she had no shortage of new friends. But the irony was that Cleo hadn't, for even a second, realized the Dante Damaso of Damaso International, Inc. was the same Dan whose name Luke casually dropped into conversation on occasion. Luke and Dante had met in college and had become friends, but were hardly the type of guys to invite each other to family gatherings. So Cleo had never had the opportunity to meet the man. She had also been way too involved with her own life, and her dancing too, wrapped up in herself, to care about Lucius and his boring friends. So it had come as a shock to learn Luke's Dan was the Dante Damaso of the renowned Damaso International chain of 5-star hotels and resorts. Only after Luke had gone all stern and disapproving big brother on her for using his relationship with Dante to get a job did the penny drop. That's when she'd understood that she'd probably gotten the job because she was Luke's sister, a favor neither Luke nor Cleo had actually asked for. By that time, it had been too late to back out, and Cleo had been determined to make the best of the chance she'd been given. Of course, if she had actually met Dante Damaso during the interview process, she may very well have told him to shove his job. But his minions had conducted the recorded interviews, and Dante had supposedly made his decision after watching the recordings. Cleo didn't know what she'd expected of Dante Damaso, but from the very first day, he had made it clear he merely suffered her presence, and just half an hour into her first day after, asking her to make him a cup of coffee, photocopy some documents, send 2 emails, one of which she had messed up by leaving off a 0 in a seriously huge number, and water his frickin' ficus. He had sent her downstairs to a junior executive. Once there, the junior exec's assistant had patronizingly ushered Cleo to a desk and instructed her to answer the phone if it rang, before the woman checked her makeup and swanned off with a breezy, "Mr. Damaso needs me to assist him today." The memory still made Cleo seethe 4 months later, and she clenched her teeth when she thought of how consistently, after that first encounter, the same thing had happened. She began every day in Damaso's office suite, and after half an hour, during which she had the dubious privilege of making his coffee and watering that stupid ficus, or sometimes sending one of those loathsome little "thanks for the sex" notes, she got shipped off to a different exec. Luckily, the other executives had stopped giving her mundane tasks to do, and she'd started enjoying her daily little soirees away from the boss's office. Still, the half hours in the mornings had become almost unbearable. Dante was scathing, brutally frank in his dismissal of her skills, and almost unbearably rude. He never greeted her, never used common courtesies like "please" and "thank you" when he spoke with her, and Cleo was convinced a smile would crack his perfect face. Dante was still grimly focused on his iPad, and Cleo went back to greedily watching the passing scenery, trying to commit as much of it to memory as she could, while longing to be out there exploring the wonderful mix of old and new. She loved the wooden buildings that looked as if they'd been around since the Middle Ages, tucked away down alleys and overshadowed by aggressively modern, monolithic skyscrapers. Nothing escaped her attention, and she tried to file away the interesting bits, wanting to research and read up on buildings, museums, and shops that captured her interest, all of which helped keep her mind off Dante's disturbing presence. Praise Jesus. They had donuts. Cleo barely noticed all the bowing and talking around her as her senses homed in on that single, all-important fact. By now she was so hungry she actually felt faint, and if she could only get her hands on one of those gorgeous hoops of sugary goodness, all would be right with her world. She nodded dazedly at the half-circle of somber-looking businessmen in dark suits bowing to her, and was barely aware of the tall, dark presence looming beside her as her eyes drifted again and again to the tempting display of coffee and pastries set up over to the side. The painfully prolonged polite greetings finally over, she stealthily drifted over to the table of goodies. She was just a finger's length away from a chocolate-glazed precious with her name written all over it when a firm hand clamped down on her elbow. Her empty stomach sank to the bottom of her sensible shoes, and she stared up at her boss with what she knew was the most effectively pathetic hangdog expression in her arsenal. But he was having none of it. His jaw was clenched so tightly, she was amazed his teeth didn't crack. She gave one final forlorn look at the donuts before he led her to the long conference table in the center of the room. "Try to pay attention," he muttered in her ear as he planted her into a seat that, cruelly, faced the delicious spread just a table's breadth away from her. What followed was the longest, most boring, and torturous 3 hours of Cleo's life. The meeting was conducted entirely in Japanese, which Cleo didn't speak, but Dante most certainly did, and quite fluently too, from what she could tell. She didn't know why she was there. He had a dictaphone recording the meeting, so even if she'd been able to understand what was going on, she wouldn't have had to take notes anyway. All she could do was stare at the donuts and other delicious goodies in front of her and imagine how they tasted. At one point, a fly landed on her donut. It took everything she had not to jump up with a primal scream and chase it away. Instead, she watched in revulsion as it crawled over every inch of her beautiful donut. She nearly sobbed in disappointment, gave up on the chocolate one, and shifted her attention to a gorgeous eclair on a different platter. But when that bastard fly, which she had now named Damaso Jr., landed on her eclair as well, she slumped back in her chair and stared glumly down at the blank notebook in front of her. She picked up her pen and started scribbling. Hoping to at least look busy, she composed truly awful haiku and observations about the people seated around the table. Her attempt at describing Dante, hard of abs he is, beautiful to look at, sure. My God, what a dick. Okay, maybe that last line was a little ambiguous. Was it an insult or a compliment? Even Cleo wasn't sure. After several even worse attempts, Cleo gave up on the haiku. She segued into doodling, occasionally looking up and nodding to make it seem like she was listening to every incomprehensible word being spoken. She glanced over at Dante and was delighted to note that he'd perched his dark-rimmed spectacles on the tip of his nose. She'd seen them before, of course, but loved how truly nerdy they made him look. Sexy nerdy, but it was a flaw, and she'd take it. The only other woman present, Ms. Inokawa, also slanted surreptitious glances at Dante and smiled demurely every time he spoke with her. If not for the calculating gleam in her pretty eyes, Cleo would have thought the woman sweet and slightly shy. But beneath all that saccharine sweetness beat the heart of a scheming seductress, and she had her sights on Dante. Well, she was welcome to him. All Cleo wanted was a donut. Maybe that caramel one. It looked like the fly had skipped, damn it. Sure enough, as if drawn to it by her thoughts, the fly landed on that one too. By the time the meeting was over, the damned thing would have... Miss Knight? She jerked upright, realizing Dante had been trying to get her attention. Yes? I asked if you got that. That? What? Wait, had they finally said something in English and she'd missed it? Damn it.